the smaller one.
Yeah.
No, that game was good as hell.
Yeah, but I really wish they had Kang the Conqueror in there.
Yeah, I wish they had Fantastic Four in there too.
Yo, no, I actually saw a video that shows exactly why those characters aren't in there.
Yeah, why?
Comic book bust.
What's that?
Hold on, I'll show you.
Oh, wow.
Hello, my name is Aiden Shea. Welcome to this lecture about the 1990s comic book bust.
No, alright.
Oh, shit.
Hi there, I'm Captain America. So you want to learn about the 1990s comic book bust. But first, let's give you some information before then. Before the 1990s, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and leading up until the late 1980s, comic books were made for kids primarily by Marvel and DC Entertainment. The stories, primarily composed of fictional characters that were focusing on lighthearted and, for the most part, child-friendly events. Children from these time periods, which is the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, leading up until the 80s, for the most part, didn't really understand how valuable these comics would be in the future. So they would buy them at their local supermarket, or their comic book store, or even like at a local bookstore. And when they would go there to get these comics, they would buy them, they would put them in their pockets, then they would kind of walk out, they would fold them up, they would kind of destroy them. Comic books in the future would actually become a lot of the more rare and expensive comics. So then when people were looking for them, it was kind of hard to find them because they weren't as available anymore, because they'd all been destroyed, used in like paper drives or recycled. That was especially prevalent in the 1930s and 40s when World War I, World War II were going on, and there was tons of need for different war efforts, and so people would have paper drives and tons of comics would be used there. So Action Comics 1, an extremely expensive and rare comic now, would probably be used a lot during that time period, and that's why it's so rare now. Hence why you can see action book comics selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases in mint condition. And by the 1970s, a lot of these children who were in the 1930s and 40s reading comics were now becoming young adults, or were adults. And they had a lot of nostalgia and almost a yearning, I guess, to read their old comics and to read these things from the old time periods. And that brought a lot of need and a lot of want into a new market of old comic books. And these new adults, or even older adults, who wanted these comics started to become a majority, and Marvel Comics as a whole started to notice this. And so you started to see an incline in ads in Marvel Comics for older comics, tons of old stock. So you might see a Marvel Comics from like the 1930s just being entirely plain, and then you move on like 30, 40 years to the 1960s and 70s, and then you start to see these little tickets all around the place that had 250,000 stock of Action Comics 436, and that would be all sold for $30,000, and then someone would buy all of that and then distribute it. It would be distributed to all of the people who wanted the comics, who wanted to read the comics because they didn't have those comics before, and so on and so forth. And thus, it created almost a market. It really started the market for comics and the value that they may hold in the future because of their age and because of the rarity that comics held. Now, this comic book back issue market was primarily started by Marvel Comics, and the real reason that it all started was because of the creation of the Fantastic Four issue #1, which brought into picture the Marvel Universe, which was a really complex and a really hard to understand entity, which has spanned the course of many, many generations and many, many people. And the way that the Marvel Universe works is that it brings in tons of different stories and characters from all around the Marvel Universe, and then it kind of just like mixes them with people. titles. That's why you'll see Iron Man in a Spider-Man story, or you'll see the Hulk in a Fantastic Four story. So people needed to have info on these comics from the past, and that was a really massive reason that I actually mentioned before this, people wanting to read these comics from the past, because they wanted to learn more about the characters, they wanted to learn more to help better understand the story and what the story was bringing to their understanding and knowledge of Marvel Comics as a whole. And also because just Marvel Comics as a whole and the universe is becoming extremely confusing with all these different things being added, new characters, different storylines, and people honestly were getting lost in it. And so they had to go back and find these older comics to be able to read them. Therefore, these back issues became a really major market in Marvel Comics, and just in general. Marvel Comics were the people who started it, and then DC Comics and eventually Image Entertainment or Image Comics would be created, and they would also do this to a lesser extent, but they would still do it. So back issues of comics became a lot more of a prevalent thing, and because of back issues of comics, it led to a lot more people starting to realize that older issues of comics existed, and this led to comic book markets and the comic book market speculations, which would later plague the industry and cause a very large factor in the comic book bust.
Oh. So, you killed Aiden Shea. Lazarus Pit?
Yeah, I think so.
Hell yeah.
Alright.
Ah, God!
Stay dead.
How are we gonna pick you up?
Is he awake?
No, not yet. You gotta wait a little bit longer. It's okay. He'll be done in like 20 minutes.
Alright. Market speculation! Oh, Jesus. Oh, look, Stu. Wait. Shut up. You know what? I think that was good. Oh, God, Captain America! Die!
In the 1990s, there were a lot of different forms of entertainment that people could have done other than reading comics. The film industry spent a lot of money on special effects and actors. The industry thought that the bigger the budget, the higher the quality of the movie is. Some notable films were released, such as Philadelphia, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, Forrest Gump, The Silence of the Lambs, Mission Impossible, Braveheart, Apollo 13, and 3 James Bond films. Also, the 90s movies dealt with themes such as racism, the Holocaust, homelessness, the AIDS epidemic, and feminism. There was also television. Cable television during the 1990s was a necessity, with new shows that catered to all sorts of people. The Simpsons, Seinfeld, Full House, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and Saved by the Bell, just to name a few. Also, in the 1980s and 1990s, Atari and Nintendo popularized the video gaming market. This was just after the video game crash as well, and Nintendo had revitalized the video game market after it was killed by a flood of poorly made and rushed out games. Not unlike how the comic book industry had crashed later in 1989, similar concept. The Game Boy was released and it was a big success, selling over 118.69 million units throughout its life. And this system showed the world the viral game Pokemon. In the 1990s, the battle was between the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Genesis, with Mario and Sonic respectively battling for the best console in the market. Both consoles put out great games, like Sonic the Hedgehog, Super Mario World, Altered Beast, and Street Fighter II. These different forms of entertainment could have gotten people away from comics. But then, two particular comics came out that caught everybody's attention. Leading up to the comic book bust in 1986, Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns were published. They were extremely popular, and even people who didn't read comic books knew about them. Other companies tried to capitalize on the darkness and the mature ideas in those comics because they thought that violence made the comics more popular, while in reality, the ideas and themes in Watchmen and The Dark Knight Rises were the things that made them popular. At the same time, comic book companies were starting to market to adults because they had more money to spend time with than children. During this time, Image Comics was founded by a group of extremely popular artists known as Rockstar Comics, who wanted more creative freedom and the ability to profit off of their characters. Its breakout character, Spawn. Spawn is an assassin who was betrayed, who made a deal with the devil to be resurrected as a Hellspawn, and became the anti-hero. If this doesn't scream 90s comics, nothing does. And with these adults going back into comics, they wanted to read their childhood comics. But, as we said before, these Golden and Silver Age comics were not seen as valuable, and for most of the time, discarded as waste, thus increasing the rarity and making it so that anyone who would want to read and keep these books would have to pay a lot of money. With people buying these rare comic books for high prices, the media took notice and reported on it. This got people thinking that they too can buy comics now and then sell them for an absurd amount, possibly getting their kids through college or paying for their horrible rent issues. The list goes on and on. So people bought comics that they thought would be the most expensive later, like the ones with different covers, first appearances of a character, and a large change in the status quo of the comic universe, like the death of Superman, or a first issue of a comic. With these sales, the comics industry took notice and decided to capitalize on the comic mania. The publishers started to publish more comics and started to publish a lot more new comics and new characters, and they decided that nothing mattered except the comic that came out. So, the story was largely neglected. This is why most people don't actively seek 90s comic books, as most of them are just filler for the industry. With all of these people buying comic books, comic stores were buying comics from publishers in such huge amounts where they had too much excess surplus. Then, years later, when people were trying to sell these comics off, they realized that the comics that they had bought were worthless because everybody else had bought the exact same comics. With a large net loss, many people left the comics market altogether, which brought down the sale of comics and made many comic stores go out of business. This made both Marvel and DC lose a ridiculous amount of money. So much money that Marvel had to declare bankruptcy. This led Marvel to eventually sell off many of their characters to foreign companies in order to try and stay afloat. They would auction off famous characters such as Iron Man, Spider-Man, Captain America, all of the X-Men, and many others, just to try and make sure that they didn't lose their business. Comic book movies have had a lot of ups and downs throughout the decades. The first movie, based on a Marvel or DC property, was Superman and the Mole Men in 1951. It was only an hour long. The next film that came was the 1966 Batman movie, starring the late Adam West, and it made $1.7 million. Then there was the 1980 movie Superman, that made $300 million off of a $50 million budget and spawned 3 other sequels. This movie made people realize that the superhero movies were a good source of money. So, in 1986, Marvel decided to license one of their characters to Lucasfilm. And that movie was Howard the Duck, which was critically panned by almost everybody of the time period. DC had a couple of hits, but also a few critical flops. Marvel's movies were mostly panned by critics, up until Blade, which was a commercial success, and the X-Men series, which was both a critical and commercial success. And it spawned an entire film franchise. Then, in 2002, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was released, and it was another big critical and commercial success. With these films making so much money, Marvel was not getting a lot of it because they decided to sell off their characters. So, they decided to try their hand in making their own movies. They struck a deal with Merrill Lynch to get $525 million in order to make their own movies. And, if they failed, Marvel would give up the rights to 10 of their characters to Merrill Lynch. Then, in 2008, Iron Man was released to a widespread critical acclaim, and it made $585 million. With this success, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was born, and it has currently made over $21.38 billion in total. Looking on the other side of the spectrum, at DC Comics, they've had a lot of successes, but have also had a decent amount of failures. Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy has been critically and commercially successful, but their attempt at a cinematic universe has not been as well received as Marvel's, with many people disliking the way that DC is trying to rush in their universe and not give their characters enough time to develop and grow. A notable film that follows this trend is Batman vs. Superman, which was an attempted sequel of 2013's Man of Steel. Even though it did very well at the box office, people did not understand why Batman and Superman did certain things. Take the Martha incident, for example. Batman spent the entire movie convincing the audience that Superman is a threat to humanity, and right as he is about to deliver the killing blow, Superman utters the infamous words, "Save Martha." And with those words hanging in the air, Batman realizes that his mother and Superman's mother share the same name, and they make up and decide to go take down Lex Luthor. Comic books have been around for 80 years, and have had a long and varied existence. They were treated as kid stuff and trash, and now are worth more than gold. People value entertainment and nostalgia, and no matter what, people like looking at their past to the glory days. Much like the economy and the economic comic book industry that went through the cycles of ups and downs. First, the speculator market goes very far up as everyone realizes that they want to buy comics and try and make their own small fortune off of them. Then everyone realizes the speculator market is too inflated, and as such, they have trouble selling their comics. Because of that, people stop buying, and the prices start going way down. Then, years later, people still feel the aftermath of the market crash when their comics were worth nothing. This happened in the Great Depression, where people were left with pennies after buying overinflated stocks, and then the market crashed, and people were left with nothing. People keep making the same mistakes. Same thing happened with the housing crisis. People bought too much and got too many liens, and then it all crashed. Human nature is a powerful force, and no matter what, people will think that they are better and smarter than those before them. But no one can outsmart nature. And if something's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true.